Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are now going to go over the lawsuit from Rodney Jones, aka Lil Rod. He is the former employee videographer and some other title connected to Sean Combs. So let's get right into it. All right, so we're going to start with the parties of the claim. Plaintiff Rodney Jones is an American artist and music producer. Mr. Jones resides in the states of New York and California. Defendant Sean Combs is a rapper and record executive popularly known by his stage names Puff Daddy, Puffy, P. Diddy, Diddy, Brother Love, or Love. Mr. Combs came to fame in the early 1990s with his record label Bad Boy Records. He rose to prominence in the music and entertainment industry over the decades and is regularly referred to as a hip hop mogul. It goes on to provide his address, which I am not going to show because I don't want to dox anybody, so you look that up as you see fit. Here is a picture of Sean Combs. Defendant Justin Dior Combs is the son of Mr. Combs and Misa Hilton. Jay Combs was born on December 30th, 1993. Jay Combs is a producer and actor. He has appeared on TV series like Catfish, the TV show Wild and Out, and Hip Hop Squares. Defendant Justin Combs resides in LA. I'm not going to show his address. Defendant Lucian Charles, Grange, is the CEO of Defendant Universal Music Group. Defendant Charles resides in California. That is his photo for anybody who's wondering. Defendant Ethiopia, I'm not going to butcher her name, is the former CEO of Defendant Motown Records, the parent company of Defendant Love Records. She resides in California. Defendant Christina Coram is the chief of staff to Sean Diddy Combs, Combs Global Enterprises. She resides in California. Defendant Chalice Recording Studios is a popular recording studio in California. Defendant Motown Records is a record label with a principal place of business located at 1750 Vine Street, LA. Ethiopia, I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name, was the chairman and CEO of Universal Group's Motown Records. Defendant Universal Music Group is a record label with a principal place of business located in California. Lucian Grange is the chairman and CEO of Universal Music Group. Defendant Love Records is a record label with a principal place of business located in LA, California. Defendant Love Records was founded by Mr. Combs and Defendant Motown Records. Defendant Combs Enterprises is a diverse portfolio of businesses and investments that includes music, fashion, fragrance, beverage, marketing, film, television, and media properties. They have a principal place of business located in New York, New York. Excuse me. Rodney Lil Rod Jones. Rodney Lil Rod Jones Jr. is from Windy City, Chi-Town. He was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. Mr. Jones is the second oldest son and fourth child out of 9 siblings. Mr. Jones comes from a long line of gospel music influencers. Mr. Jones started playing instruments at the age of 5. He began playing drums in church, and at the age of 13, he picked up playing the guitar. From 13 to present day, Mr. Jones has taught himself to play over 13 instruments. Mr. Jones is considered a musical prodigy. His talents have led him to produce and create commercial marketplace for music that has been recorded by some of the most prestigious and highly acclaimed artists in the music industry. Throughout the duration of his career, Mr. Jones has worked the south side of Chicago music scene, playing with the following legendary acts: Georgia Mass Choir, Donald Lawrence, the Clark Sisters, and the Smoky Norfolk. On or about August 2022, Mr. Jones received a call from Mr. Combs requesting that he produce several songs on a rhythm and blues album titled The Love Album Off the Grid. Mr. Jones agreed, and his life has been detrimentally impacted ever since. So here are the summary of events. From September 2022 to November 2023, Mr. Jones produced 9 songs on Mr. Combs' Love album. Mr. Jones lived with Mr. Combs for months at a time, spending holidays, birthdays, and missing major family events. Mr. Jones resided at Mr. Combs' residence located in LA, California, New York City, and Miami, Florida. Mr. Jones also spent several weeks on a yacht rented by Mr. Combs in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Throughout his time with Mr. Combs, Mr. Jones witnessed, experienced, and endured many things that went far beyond his role as a producer on the Love album. The claims raised in this complaint have been corroborated through witness statements, video, audio recordings, and images that Mr. Combs had in his possession. Mr. Combs required Mr. Jones to record him constantly. On several occasions, Mr. Combs took Mr. Jones' cell phone and began recording himself. As a result, Mr. Jones has secured hundreds of hours of footage and audio recordings of Mr. Combs, his staff, and his guests engaging in serious illegal activity. Mr. Jones has secured irrefutable evidence of the acquisition and use of, and there's a variety of drugs I'm not going to say, the displaying and distribution of unregistered illegal GUNs. Mr. Combs provided laced alcohol beverages to minors and sex workers at his homes in California, New York, and the U.S. Virgin Islands and Florida. Mr. Combs' chief of staff, Christina Quorum, or KK, instructed her staff to retrieve drugs so she can provide it to Mr. Combs for his consumption. Christian Combs, which is the son of Diddy, drugging and sexually assaulting a woman. Mr. Combs detailing how he planned to leverage his relationship with Bishop T.D. Jakes to soften his impact on his public image of Cassie Ventura's lawsuit. Young Miami's cousin or an assistant sexually assaulting Mr. Jones. Actor Cuba Gooding Jr. sexually harassing and assaulting Mr. Jones. Rapper, which name is redacted, on Mr. Combs' yacht consorting with underage girls, sex workers, and R&B singer, which name is redacted, in Mr. Combs' LA home consorting with underage girls and sex workers. Now, I want to say this. There is an amended lawsuit that was filed by Rodney Jones, and I believe in that lawsuit, all of the names that have been redacted were added to that amended complaint, and we'll go over that at another time, but I just wanted to throw that in there. On or about September 12, 2022, Mr. Combs held a writers and producers camp at the recording studio in LA. Present at this camp were Mr. Combs, his son Justin Combs, and Justin's friend named G. Mr. G is a 30-year-old tall African American male. In addition to these individuals, other musicians were present at the camp. This writer has spoken to several musicians who attended the camp. One evening during the camp, Mr. Combs, J. Combs, and G were in a heated conversation. The conversation was moved out of the studio and into a restroom adjacent to where Mr. Combs was sitting. Mr. Combs was approximately 2 feet away from the bathroom when GUN shots rang out. Mr. Jones recalls hearing multiple GUN shots. Mr. Jones immediately went into a state of shock and feared that he would be shot next. Mr. Jones genuinely believed he would be shot through the bathroom door due to how close he was. After the shooting ended, a crowd gathered around the restroom. When the door finally opened, Mr. Combs and J. Combs exited. G was laying on the restroom floor in fetal position, holding his stomach and bleeding out of his leg hip area. Everyone stood around looking upon G. Frustrated by the lack of aid to G, Mr. Jones dropped everything, ran to G, and immediately began placing pressure on G's gunshot wound to his stomach. As he was applying pressure to his stomach, Mr. Jones realized that G was gushing blood from either his hip or leg. He decided to lift G and place him to sit on the toilet. Mr. Jones asked the crowd to call an ambulance. Mr. Jones lifted G and brought him to the ambulance at the studio's front. At this time, Mr. Combs and Justin disappeared to another part of the studio. Mr. Combs gave strict instructions to inform the police that he had nothing to do with the shooting. He also forced Mr. Jones to lie to the police by telling them that G was shot standing outside the studio by a drive-by assailant. Mr. Jones has several corroborating witnesses who spoke with this writer anonymously due to fear of retaliation from Mr. Combs. They have agreed to speak publicly when subpoenaed. Okay, so I guess that was the article about the shooting that Mr. Jones gave an interview for. Mr. Jones has the clothing he wore that day and believes it may still have the stains and DNA of G's blood. The following are screenshots of the aftermath of the bathroom where G was shot by either Mr. Combs or J. Combs. All right. Aftermath of the shooting of G. Clearly, G was not shot outside of the studio as Mr. Combs instructed by his team to report to law enforcement. Mr. Combs and defendants LR, MR, UMG, and CRS provided private security for the writers' camp at defendant CRS. The security was porous and lackluster at best. The fact that either Mr. Combs or J. Combs were allowed to enter CRS with GUNs and those GUNs were not confiscated by security is a clear breach of duty by Mr. Combs, defendants LR, MR, and UMG to protect Mr. Jones and other attendees of the writers' camp. As a result of the shooting, Mr. Jones is severely traumatized. Mr. Jones now suffers from PTSD, severe anxiety, depression, and insomnia. Mr. Jones was sexually harassed and assaulted by Mr. Combs. Throughout his time living with Mr. Combs, Mr. Jones was the victim of constant, unsolicited, and unauthorized groping and touching of his anus by Mr. Combs. These events took place in LA, New York, and Florida, and the United States Virgin Islands. In addition to the unsolicited and unauthorized touching, Mr. Jones was forced by Mr. Combs to work in Mr. Combs' bathroom as Mr. Combs walked around naked and showered in a clear glass enclosure. As a heterosexual Christian man, Mr. Jones was uncomfortable with Mr. Combs' advances and expressed his discomfort to Mr. Jones' chief of staff, KK. KK responded to Mr. Jones' complaint with, shine will be shine. KK also attempted to downplay Mr. Combs' groping of Mr. Jones' anus and genitals as friendly horseplay, stating that those acts were Mr. Combs' way of showing that he likes you. Despite the assurances on several occasions when Mr. Combs began to undress and walk around the house naked, KK would say, "Okay, I am leaving now," and she would disappear. KK's hypocrisy is breathtaking at best, or enabling at worst. Mr. Jones believed that KK aided and abetted Mr. Combs' sexual assault of him and was working with Mr. Combs to groom him into accepting a homosexual relationship. Through these sexual deviant acts, one would say Mr. Combs has a pattern of practice of engaging in near nefarious activity. This ongoing conduct shows that Mr. Combs cannot be rehabilitated. Mr. Combs attempted to groom Mr. Jones into engaging in gay sex. Mr. Combs was aware that Mr. Jones looked up to and idolized music producer Stephen Aaron Jordan, Stevie J. Stevie J is an American DJ, record producer, and television personality. Stevie J was part of the Bad Boy Records production team at Hitman. In 1997, Stevie J won a Grammy for his work on Puff Daddy's debut album. Throughout the late 1990s, Stevie J produced for several artists including Mariah Carey, Tevin Campbell, The Notorious B.I.G., 112, Jodeci, Faith Evans, Jay-Z, and Eve. Stevie J was one of the producers on the Love album. Mr. Combs used access to Stevie J and his knowledge of Mr. Jones' admiration to Stevie J to groom and entice Mr. Jones to engage in homosexuality. Mr. Combs went so far as to share a video of Stevie J anally penetrating a Caucasian male without a condom. Everything I'm reading is alleged until proven in a court of law by a competent jury of Mr. Combs, Stevie J, and others listed on this lawsuit. Okay. This was done to ease Mr. Jones' anxiety concerning homosexuality. According to Mr. Combs, this is a normal practice in the music industry. Look, even Stevie J is doing it. Mr. Combs informed Mr. Jones that he had engaged in sexual intercourse with rapper Redacted, R&B singer Redacted, and Stevie J. Mr. Combs promised to make sure that Mr. Jones wins Producer of the Year at the Grammys if he engaged in homosexuality. The following are screenshots of the video of Stevie J anally penetrating a Caucasian male that Mr. Combs provided to Mr. Jones. Again, everything is alleged until proven in the court of law. I am not going to show this screenshot at all. Thanksgiving 2022. Mr. Jones is sexually assaulted by Young Miami's cousin. On Thanksgiving Day 2022, Mr. Jones was in Mr. Combs' house located in Miami, Florida. Young Miami and her female cousins were also present. Mr. Combs was intoxicated and offered the white powder to Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones rejected him and proceeded to walk into the restroom. While using the restroom, young Miami's cousin burst into the bathroom and began groping Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones believes that Mr. Combs sent her in there to sexually assault Mr. Jones. As she entered the bathroom, she dropped to her knees and began performing oral on Mr. Jones, exposing his. Mr. Jones pushed her away and exited the bathroom. Young Miami's cousin did not accept Mr. Jones' rejection as she proceeded to follow Mr. Jones out of the bathroom. She started undressing and attempted to straddle him and have sex with him in the presence of Mr. Combs and his staff. Once again, Mr. Jones pushed her off. The following are images from a video of Young Miami, her cousin, and Mr. Combs. Okay, so there are some screenshots, guys. All right, Trafficking and Victims Protection Act. All his time with Mr. Combs, Mr. Jones was transported from California to New York, Florida, and the United States Virgin Islands. During this time, Mr. Jones was forced to solicit sex workers and perform sex acts to the pleasure of Mr. Combs. On or about February 4th, 2023, Mr. Combs forced Mr. Jones to bring prostitutes and sex workers back to his home in Miami, Florida. And this is a screenshot of, I guess, Mr. Jones bringing someone back to Florida or wherever. On or about February 2nd, 2023, incident. Mr. Jones believes Mr. Combs drugged him. Mr. Jones recalls waking up naked, dizzy, and confused. He was in bed with two sex workers and Mr. Combs. He also recalls aimlessly wandering around the house with no clothes on. Okay. On another occasion in Miami, Florida, on Thanksgiving night of 2022, Mr. Combs asked Mr. Jones and DeForest Taylor to enter the studio bathroom. He asked them for a $100 bill because he wanted them to do the white powder with him. Mr. Jones was scared, but luckily he did not have a $100 bill. So Mr. Combs waited a little later to do the white powder with Young Miami. Later that evening, he required Mr. Jones to solicit sex workers from Booby Trap on the river located in Miami, Florida. Mr. Jones did so, and Mr. Combs forced him to engage in unsolicited sex acts with these workers. As part of Mr. Jones' sex worker recruitment tools, Mr. Combs provided Mr. Jones with an exclusive bad boy baseball cap and required him to wear it to booby trap on the river as a signal to any sex worker he approached that Mr. Combs was in town and had sent Mr. Jones to recruit them. Mr. Jones had no desire to visit Booby Trap on the river. Mr. Jones had no desire to solicit sex workers from Booby Trap on the river. Mr. Jones used his power and influence to intimidate and force Mr. Jones into soliciting sex workers from Booby Trap on the river. As detailed below, Mr. Combs used many tactics to maintain dominion and control over Mr. Jones. Apparently, these workers were accustomed to servicing Mr. Combs and would know that he is in town by the sight of the bad boy's baseball cap. The following are Instagram profiles of two of the sex workers that Mr. Combs required Mr. Jones to solicit and have sex with at his home in Miami, Florida. Thankfully, their faces have already been redacted. Mr. Jones has no desire to solicit or have sex with the individuals in the previous paragraph. Mr. Combs used his power and influence to intimidate and force Mr. Jones into soliciting and sleeping with these women. The following is the phone number of another sex worker that Mr. Combs required Mr. Jones to solicit and perform sex acts with at his home in Miami, Florida. Number has been redacted. Mr. Jones had no desire to solicit or have sex with the individual in the previous paragraphs. Mr. Jones used his power and influence to intimidate and force Mr. Jones into soliciting and sleeping with the individuals above. Mr. Combs used many tactics to maintain dominion and control over Mr. Jones. He promised him a Grammy for Producer of the Year for the Love album. He also offered him $250,000 to purchase all the instruments he wanted. He promised him ownership of his $20 million property, One Star Island in Miami, Florida. He promised access to record label executives like Defendants L.C. Grange and Ethiopia H. Mr. Combs would often switch up his approach. He would go from promising Mr. Jones the world to threatening Mr. Jones with physical harm. Mr. Combs threatened to eat Mr. Jones' face and informed Mr. Jones that he is willing to unalive his mother, Janice Combs, if he must in order to get what he wants, so he wouldn't think twice to harm Mr. Jones. Mr. Combs and J. Combs solicits drugs and engages in illicit sex acts with minors and sex workers. On or about July 2nd, 2023, in California, Mr. Combs had a listening party at his home. Present at this party was an R&B artist whose name has been redacted, J. Combs, sex workers, and some underage girls. The event began at 7 p.m. Mr. Combs requested female sex workers and required Mr. Jones to solicit them. An hour later, several sex workers appeared. In addition to sex workers, there were at least 5 women in the crowd that were under the age of 16. Mr. Combs forced all of the women to drink laced liquor. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs laced the liquor with ecstasy. Mr. Combs did not check the identification of any of these underage girls. The presence of these underage women made Mr. Jones very uncomfortable. He attempted to leave, and Mr. Combs forced him to stay. Mr. Combs went so far to take Mr. Jones' car keys to prevent him from leaving. After being forced to drink the laced liquor, Mr. Jones began feeling lightheaded and recalls passing out and waking up at 4 a.m. the following morning naked with a sex worker sleeping next to him. Screenshots of a video from that night is embedded below. Okay. Mr. Combs attempts to pass off Mr. Jones to Cuba Gooding Jr. Again, all of this is alleged until proven in a court of law. Mr. Jones believes that Mr. Combs was grooming him to pass him off to his friends. This fear became reality when Mr. Combs introduced Mr. Jones to Cuba Gooding Jr. while they were on Mr. Combs' yacht. During the introduction, Mr. Combs suggested that Cuba get to know Mr. Jones better. He then left them alone in a makeshift studio on the lot. As evidenced by a video of which screenshots are embedded below, Cuba Gooding Jr. began touching, groping, and fondling Mr. Jones' legs, his upper inner thighs near his groin, the small of his back near his buttocks, and his shoulders. Mr. Jones was extremely uncomfortable and proceeded to lean away from Mr. Gooding Jr. He rejected his advances, and Mr. Gooding Jr. did not stop until Mr. Jones forcibly pushed him away. The following is a screenshot of the encounter with Cuba Gooding Jr. Oh boy. Throughout his time with Mr. Combs, Mr. Jones was under an implied work for hire agreement. He was not compensated for his time living with Mr. Combs or for the songs he produced. As evidence, he was listed as a producer for the following songs on the Love album's final release: Deliver Me, Stay Part 1, Reaching, What's Love, Stay a While, Moments, Need Somebody, Homecoming, and Tough Love. Combs and defendants LRMR, UMG all benefited from Mr. Jones' work product. They failed to compensate Mr. Jones for his work. As a result, Mr. Combs and defendants LRMR, UMG were all unjustly enriched at the expense of Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones attempted to work with Mr. Combs to secure his publishing and royalty rights for the work he completed on the Love album. Mr. Combs only offered Mr. Jones $29,000 for 13 months, thousands of hours of work, and 9 songs that made it to the Love album. Ironically, Mr. Jones was willing to take $50,000, his publishing and royalties. Mr. Combs' self-serving greed would not allow him to pay Mr. Jones an additional $21,000. Mr. Combs' deceptive business practices became so bad that Mr. Jones, who was left with no choice other than to make a public plea on social media for Mr. Combs to pay him for his work, After publicly requesting that Mr. Combs do the right thing and pay him fairly, Mr. Jones received an onslaught of threatening messages from Stevie J and Love Records A&R DeForest Taylor. All right, so it says here, I don't know, it says you plan. Somebody responds, I'm in the studio. Okay, so I guess DeForest, which is the A&R for Love Records, sends him a text that says you plan. And Mr. Jones responds with, I'm in the studio. And then Mr. Taylor responds, LOL, you 100% liar and weirdo. Good luck. Number still same. Run into NIGGA. Come talk to me in public on a public podcast and forum. According to Mr. Jones, Mr. Combs is very forceful and demanding. Mr. Combs does not take no for an answer and would often threaten to inflict bodily harm on Mr. Jones if Mr. Jones did not comply with his demands. As detailed above, Mr. Combs threatened to eat Mr. Jones' face. On another occasion, while standing in Mr. Combs' bedroom, Mr. Jones was forced to watch Mr. Combs display his GUNs and bragged about getting away with shooting people. Mr. Combs shared that he was responsible for the shooting in a nightclub in New York City with rapper Shine. Ooh. He shared that artist and Mr. Combs' girlfriend at the time, J-Lo, carried the GUN into the nightclub for him and passed him the GUN after he got into an altercation with another individual. The shooting in Shallot's recording studio confirmed Mr. Combs' statement. These statements, reinforced by Mr. Jones' fear of Mr. Combs, and strengthened Mr. Combs' dominion and control over Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones was terrified of Mr. Combs. He felt like he could not tell him no. Mr. Combs consistently made it clear that he has immense power in the music industry and with law enforcement. Mr. Combs made it clear that his head of security, Fahim Mohammed or Mr. Muhammad, had the power to make people and problems disappear. This is a photo of Mr. Muhammad. Mr. Combs instructs his staff to always contact Mr. Muhammad if they ever pulled over by the police in Miami or California. Upon information and belief, Mr. Muhammad spoke with the LAPD after G was shot at CRS. The LAPD was in CRS and witnessed the blood in the restroom, and they went with the bogus claim that the shooting of G occurred outside of the studio. This was all thanks to Mr. Muhammad's connections with law enforcement. Mr. Jones had no reason to disbelieve Mr. Combs as he had seen firsthand through the shooting of G and subsequent silence of the LAPD and the medium that Mr. Combs indeed had the power to harm him. The LAPD spent hours in CRS after the shooting of G, yet there were no arrests. Mr. Jones witnessed the LAPD in the restroom pictured above, yet no arrests were made. The morning after the shooting, Mr. Jones and several others arrived at CRS, and G's blood was still on the floor of the restroom, and Mr. Combs hired a cleanup crew to clean it up. All right. So now defendants Ethiopia H, Lucian, Charles Grange, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group, aided and abetted and profited off of Sean Combs' RICO enterprise. Mr. Jones recalls seeing defendant Grange visiting Mr. Combs' home in Miami, Florida, and LA. According to Mr. Jones, whenever defendant Grange visited Mr. Combs at his homes, it would be in the evening and he and Mr. Combs would disappear for hours in Mr. Combs' bedroom. Defendant Grange sponsored and attended several Love album listing parties at Mr. Combs' home in LA. These parties were sponsored by defendants MRLR and UMG. As evidence above, these parties had sex workers and underage girls present. During these parties, defendant Grange knew or should have known that Mr. Combs was drugging the attendees with lace bottles of tequila and Ciroc vodka. It is no secret that Mr. Combs had specific bottles of alcohol designated for females and other bottles designated for his staff, his artists, and himself. The fact was detailed by former artists and bodyguards of Mr. Combs. As a sponsor of these events, defendant Grange had a duty and obligation to ensure that sex workers and underage girls were not present and that Mr. Combs was not spiking the alcohol with grape drugs. On YouTube channel The Art of Dialogue, former bodyguard Gene Deal exposed Mr. Combs' pill mixing method used to spike cranberry juice in orange juice. According to Mr. Deal, Mr. Combs would place ecstasy and other date grape drugs in the juices. On YouTube, The Art of Dialogue, former artist Mark Curry exposed Mr. Combs spiking bottles of Moet champagne in the VIP section of nightclubs. Mr. Combs will have a set of Moet champagne bottles for his artists and a set for women. This is all again alleged, y'all. This writer has spoken with several former employees of Mr. Combs who witnessed defendant KK instruct her staff to lace champagne, tequila, Ciroc liquor bottles with ecstasy and other illicit drugs. Mr. Jones recalls seeing defendant H, this is Ethiopia H, visiting Mr. Combs' home in Miami, Florida, and LA. According to Mr. Jones, whenever defendant H visited Mr. Combs at his homes, it would be in the evening and she and Mr. Combs would disappear for hours in Mr. Combs' bedroom. According to Mr. Jones, defendant H visited Mr. Combs at defendant CRS during Mr. Combs' writing camp. Defendant H sponsored and attended several Love album listening parties at Mr. Combs' home in LA. These parties were sponsored by defendants MR, LR, UMG. As evidence above, these parties had sex workers and underage girls present. During these parties, defendant H knew or should have known that Mr. Combs was drugging the attendees through laced bottles of tequila and Ciroc vodka. As a sponsor of these events, defendant H had a duty and obligation to ensure that sex workers and underage girls were not present and that Mr. Combs was not spiking the alcohol with date grape drugs. Defendant KK is it Guyleen? I can never pronounce her name right. Maxwell to Sean Combs, Jeffrey Epstein. According to Mr. Jones, during the 13 months he lived and traveled with Mr. Combs, he witnessed Mr. Combs display and distribute GUNs from his bedroom closet in Miami and LA to questionable individuals dressed in all black. According to Mr. Jones, during the 13 months that he lived and traveled with Mr. Combs, he witnessed defendant KK openly order her assistants to keep Mr. Combs high off gummies and pills. It is important to defendant KK to have Mr. Combs' drug of choice immediately ready when he asks for it. Defendant KK ordered sex workers and prostitutes for Mr. Combs. Defendant KK ordered and distributed a plethora of drugs to Mr. Combs and his celebrity guests who were present on his rented yacht and in his homes in LA, New York, and Miami. On multiple occasions, defendant KK forced Mr. Jones to carry Mr. Combs' drug pouch against his will. As the chief of staff, defendant KK was instrumental in organizing and executing the RICO enterprise. Defendant KK had the following individuals execute the following tasks for the RICO enterprise. Stevie J, who would recruit sex workers and attend and participate in freak-offs. Justin Combs, who would solicit prostitutes, underage girls, and sex workers. He would also engage in freak-offs. Brendan Paul, who worked as Mr. Combs' mule. He acquires and distributes Mr. Combs' drugs and GUNs. This is all alleged. Here are some pictures. Moy Bond hires sex workers and attends and participates in freak-offs. Mr. Combs funded and used his affiliation with local GANGs and GANG leaders who would frequent his homes in LA and Miami to secure drugs and GUNs he obtained and distributed out of his homes in LA and Miami. Defendants executed their RICO enterprise with threats of violence, threatening to eat plaintiff's face, displaying and distributing GUNs in plaintiff's presence, bragging about having law enforcement under control, bragging about unaliving people, and bragging about bribing witnesses and jurors in the criminal case concerning the 1999 New York City nightclub shooting with Shine. Defendants executed the RICO enterprise with threats of isolation from the music and entertainment industry, parading powerful music industry executives such as defendants Mr. Grange, Ethiopia H, at his parties filled with sex workers, minor, and illegal drugs such as, I'm not going to name them. Defendants executed their RICO enterprise with threats of non-payment for work, completed fake promises of cash payments in the amount of $250,000, producer of the year Grammy Awards, and guaranteed access to future projects, and a $20 million home on Star Island in Miami. While living and traveling with Mr. Combs, Mr. Jones discovered that Mr. Combs has hidden cameras in every room of his homes. Mr. Jones believes that Mr. Combs has recordings of Mr. Grange, Ethiopia H, as well as other celebrities, music label execs, politicians, and athletes. Upon information and belief, these individuals were recorded without their knowledge and consent, and as is the case with the homosexual sex tape of Stevie J that Mr. Combs provided to Mr. Jones. Mr. Combs possesses compromising footage of every person that has attended his freak off parties and his house parties. Upon information and belief due to his treasure trove of evidence he has in his possession, Mr. Combs believes that he is above the law and is untouchable. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs employs Jose Cruz as his IT director. This writer has spoken to several former employees of Mr. Combs who confirmed that Jose is the gatekeeper to all of Mr. Combs' recordings. Upon information and belief, Jose intentionally hides behind the camera and from social media and the internet due to all of the incriminating acts he was required to record for Mr. Combs. Okay, guys, so I really don't want to get deep into the cause of action. I really want to wait to see how this lawsuit is going to play out. I just wanted to go over the highlights of the lawsuit, and we have done that. And so I will catch you on the next one, and leave me some comments. Let me know what you think. What are your opinions so far regarding the lawsuits that I've shared with you guys? And I'll catch y'all on the next one. Peace.